Welcome to Prose from the Underground, coming to you from my basement in northern Michigan, where I read, write, think, and say things. And quite often, I end up talking with someone. Today, I'm talking with Stephen Eoannou, a writer from Buffalo, New York. Nearly the opposite end of the Great Lakes is my neck of the woods. As you'll see, Stephen has an affinity for historical fiction. His third novel, Yesteryear, is coming into the world. I was lucky enough to read it. It follows the story of Fran Striker, the radio playwright who invented the Lone Ranger. It's set in the 1930s, so the novel is filled with all kinds of economic struggle, desperation even, that leads to some bad decisions and some peril. What's especially interesting, I think, is the relationship or the dance between historical fact and the freedom that Eouannou allows himself to tell a gripping story. And I mean gripping as in page turner in many places. If you're interested in historical fiction, this is for you. If you're interested in just a darn good novel that takes some, I think, far out but successful risks, this is for you as well. Here's Stephen. Here we are with Stephen Eoannou. And we are talking primarily about Yesteryear, his novel that is now in the world, set in the 30s. Tons of research is going on here. It's not as though it's explicit. The novel reads, I believe, very smoothly and cleanly, as though we're steeped in the moment. And yet I can sense that a lot of research went into this. So I wonder, first, could you talk to us about the research that it takes, how you go about that? Are there any particular resources, people, places, hidden doorways that send you into the past?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. Research was a huge part of this book because I didn't know anything about Fran Striker's story when I first started out. And I've always been fascinated by the period of the 30s and the war years because my parents grew up at that time, and I was filled with my dad's stories, which really are there's a lot of them in Yesteryear, as a matter of fact. So when I started the research, I said, okay, the two big players here are George W. Trendle, the owner of WXYZ, who commissioned Striker to write The Lone Ranger, and then Fran Striker himself. So I started tracking down biographies of those two. Striker died in 1962. He never had a chance to write his autobiography, but his son did. His son wrote a biography called His Typewriter Grew Spurs. Very thin book, but great insight to his dad's thinking. He had access to all the papers, of course, of his father's. And I tracked down that book in a little bookstore in Texas, and I was able to buy that. And that was a tremendous help. And then you know how it is when you do research, you read one article and then it mentions another article, or there's something in, the reference page that leads you to another book. And I saw that Trendle had his biography written by a woman named Mary Bickle. And Trendle died in 1972. That book had been out of print for decades, but I managed to track that down. So those two books were really the starting point for me. But then I found out somehow that the University of Buffalo, I still live here in Buffalo, New York. After Striker had passed away, his estate had donated all his papers to the university. So they were in the special collections. And I had access to all that as an alumni of UB. So there was probably 24 cartons. Fran saved everything: letters, contracts, memorabilia, his Remington 16 typewriter that he loved. They have it all at UB. And I would go in and make an appointment and put on the white gloves and thumb through all that primary source. And so that was a tremendous help to my research. But those three were really the two biographies, and then Striker's papers. And then, of course, so much has been written about the Lone Ranger over the last 90 years. It was easy to track down information about the Lone Ranger and how its impact on 20th century pop culture.
Sure. Before I ask the next question that I think must be asked about fiction and history, was there any, or were there many moments of revelation when you're reading these biographies, these primary sources? You got the white gloves on. Was there ever a moment where you thought, "Holy crap, this is really significant," where you felt like you discovered something that would help you launch into the story?
Well, a couple things come to mind. One was not good research or scholarly work on my part at all. It was on Facebook of all places. And I have a dear friend, a wonderful writer named Karen Celestin, who grew up in Niagara Falls, New York, not too far from here, and now lives in New Orleans. She just posted on Facebook once I had just started the research for this. She had posted on Facebook an article and had the link, and it said the article was titled something like "Was Bass Reeves the original Lone Ranger?" And I thought, where did this come from? I mean, I had just started my research, hadn't written a word of the first draft yet, and here out of the blue is this article about someone who may have been the inspiration for the Lone Ranger on Facebook of all places. So of course I clicked on it and I read the article, and that led me to another biography of Bass Reeves, who was a ex-slave and a U.S. Marshal out in the Oklahoma Territory, called Black Gun Silver Star. And it was just serendipitous, I mean, it was just Norman Mailer wrote that book, that writing's a spooky art, right? And this was like a spooky moment for me, that it just seemed like I needed some information, and there it was on Facebook of all places.
Yeah.
So that was a great light bulb moment. I guess the other one going through Fran's papers, are the letters back and forth, the Western Union telegrams between he and Trendle, and it became obvious from all the papers that Fran was the creator of the Lone Ranger character, not Trendle, as Trendle claimed later in life. And he sort of robbed Striker a lot of the fame and notoriety by retelling that lie over and over again. And if you go through the papers, it's obvious that Fran was the originator of it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I have not put my head into the facts of all this, but I could smell some compelling authorial work when I sensed when I read about the part where he gets cursed. And the curse specifically says you're not going to experience any reward for your hard work.
A little bit of foreshadowing. I was actually sitting in there's a little bar on the west side of Buffalo here, not far from my house, called the Gypsy Parlor. And it's a cool little corner bar, a great menu, little hole in the wall type of place, and the pictures are of gypsies. And I'm just sitting there by myself, waiting for my buddy to show up, and was just thinking about the book. And I said, well, why not? Why not put in this magical element to the story? Because there was already magical realism in it.
Yeah.
Why not put a curse in
Yeah.
from this woman who seemingly doesn't age? And so I did. And part of this writing this book was a lot different than the first two books I wrote. Muscle Cars, which is a short story collection, and Rook, which is a crime novel. The language is very spare and tight in those two books. And when I finished them, I was proud of them. I still am, but I felt like I was constrained. I felt like I wanted to write something big, and I was thinking specifically about The Natural by Malamud and Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella, which Field of Dreams is based on. That magical element, like creating myths, big, lush language. I wanted to write something like that. And so when I was thinking about my approach to it, I had those two books in mind, and they're both baseball novels. So my mantra for writing Yesteryear was swing for the fences, and that meant hold nothing back. If you want to put in a curse, put in a curse. If you want to have a long, winding sentence that you would never see in Rook or Muscle Cars, put it in.
Yeah.
No characters could have too big of a broad stroke, and no joke would be taboo. So
Good.
I put it all in, and just I thought, what do I have to lose?
Good.
Worst thing, the editor says it doesn't work, take it out, in which they did
Okay.
a lot of the times.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. Since we're talking about the kind of freedom that you allowed yourself, did point of view figure into that? This is either, I would be curious to see, either omniscient or serial limited third or something like that. I'll be curious to see what you want to call it. But
Yeah.
we're roaming all over the place,
We're all over the place,
and
so
that's part of the joy. So where did that
yes,
decision come?
again, coming off of writing those 17 short stories where you're limited. And then Rook alternates characters between Al Nussbaum, a bank robber, and his wife. But with Yesteryear, I was thinking big, and I was swinging away, and I knew one of the themes I wanted to explore was this idea of who wrote the Lone Ranger, where did they get the idea, and then a broader question is, in general, where do these ideas come from? Where do you get the inspiration from for stories or a novel? And the answer is they come from all over, and they're there when you need them,
Yep.
mysteriously, spookily, like Mailer said. Like my example of Karen Celestine posting about Bass Reeves as a Lone Ranger. It was there when I needed it. So to try to approach that and explore that theme, I knew I was going to need multiple points of view, not just Trendle in Detroit and Fran Striker in Buffalo. I wanted to make it bigger. So again, I did not worry about anything with this book. I said, if it's wrong, I will fix it later.
Yep.
And I'm just going to write. And I think it's omniscient, but I also jump around and kind of humanize weather patterns and weather streams and jet streams,
Yeah.
to incorporate them. So it's really an interesting book. The point of view is hard to describe, and the book's hard to describe because it's comic, it's noir, it's historical fiction, it's magical realism. I had a lot of balls in the air that I was juggling with this one.
Yeah, I think it's really pleasing in that sense for a reader like me. I'm up for it. As I tell a lot of people when I read manuscripts, I'm up for anything. Once you establish the rules, I'll play along to whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've been in an interview like this where I've actually thought of like Jacques Derrida, where I'm thinking of like you say, the source of the story is the sociology around us, and here it's really dramatized. It's in the novel itself. The source of the story, there is no source. It's multiple sources, multiple experiences, multiple tensions, multiple forms of violence and peril are all figuring into this, which is really, it's cool to hear you say that.
Well, one of the tropes I use, and we're talking about history. Goes against every history. In the novel, Fran Striker is suffering from a writer's block. Fran Striker never suffered from a writer's block for a moment of his life. It was estimated that in the 1930s, he was writing 60,000 words a week. All the radio scripts, all the comic books, all the comic strips, 60,000 words a week. It's like a short novel each week.
Right.
So that is going against history, and I knew that. But what that allowed me to do is also show where he was getting these ideas for the Lone Ranger character.
Yeah.
A character always greets him by saying, "Hi ho, Striker," which of course, is the Lone Ranger's, call sign. The story of Bass Reeves and how Bass used to throw silver dollars. Well, that's where the idea for the silver bullets came from. A robber of Trendle who robbed Trendle is wearing a terrible mask.
Yeah.
That gives him the idea for the mask. So, and that worked on a different level because all of us know all the tropes of the Lone Ranger going in. Yeah. We all know his horse is silver. We all know his friend is Tonto. We all know, the silver bullets and the masks, and Striker doesn't know him yet, but because he hasn't created him yet. but they're all around him to draw from.
Love
And
it.
and the readers know more than Striker does at that point.
Right. Yeah, which is a ton of fun. It must have been fun to write once you realized you could start looping in all of these things and creating the tropes. That's
It was a fun book to research. It was a fun book to write, and I'm hoping it's a fun book for people to read.
It is for me, I'll tell you. Let me just circle back to this question. I know lots of folks who are writing what they would call just classic historical fiction or
Mm-hmm.
fiction that's steeped in a bygone decade. And so you've done all this research. Here are all these scummy facts that are pressuring you and bullying you. Here's what happened.
Yeah.
And yet you take incredible liberty inside of that history. So how did that work? Can you tell people how you wrestled with or managed the tension between the facts and the possibilities?
Yeah, the biggest struggle I had is once I did the research and I knew the story of Stryker and the Lone Ranger, what was the timeline going to be for the novel? Because Stryker and Trendle had a professional relationship that lasted in the for 20 years. It lasted until 1954 when Trendle sold the rights to the Lone Ranger for $3 million. And of course, Stryker, he got a small bonus, but he didn't profit from his creation. So do I cover the whole 20 years? And I said, no, the turf I've kind of carved out for myself is Buffalo. I'm trying just the way William Kennedy explored Albany, New York with the Albany trilogy, and Richard Russo with upstate New York. That's what I'm trying to do with Buffalo. So, all right, let's condense the timeline and have it from the time Trendle sends that telegram asking if Stryker can write a Western until the Lone Ranger premiered about a month later on WEBR here in Buffalo, New York. So I said, okay, that's going to be my timeline. So I had my start and the beginning, and I knew what was going to happen, obviously. And then I had to move up when Stryker sold the rights away, because he didn't do that the way it's written in the novel. He sold the rights in the spring of 1934. So the Lone Ranger had already been on the air for over a year and was just starting to take off. But I condensed that to have it happen, have that occur the night of the premiere in Buffalo. So the struggle was the timing of it all. Once I knew that and got into it, I just let the characters kind of take over and become who they wanted to be. I read a lot about Stryker and Trendle, and there's other historical figures in the book. Jimmy Slattery, who was a former boxing champion from South Buffalo. I don't know if he ever met Stryker. They were alive and in the same town at the same time, but they're friends. John L. Barrett was the original Lone Ranger in that radio premiere. Stryker and he certainly knew each other. They're best friends in my book. But I didn't know, I couldn't glean anything really about their personalities from the research I did. So I just created what I thought would be interesting and fun and kind of work and with the novel. And again, I was not restraining myself at all.
Yeah.
What do I have to lose? Was my motto. Again, swinging for the fences, just let them be who they want to be.
I have to wonder also at some point if someone came up to me and said, "Here's a great page-turning novel about the origins of the Lone Ranger," I would think, how can you turn that into a page turner? My God. But what you did, there's a caper element to this too. And
That's
so you turn this into a noir caper. Well, also the story is being, it's a mob book, there's the Buffalo mob at the time that's creating all kinds of peril, and there's literally running and car chases, dark alleys.
what, Fran Striker was a man who made his career writing adventure stories, primarily radio plays. So my idea was, let's write a novel, a radio play about Fran Striker and his best friend, his Tonto, having an adventure. So the guy who wrote the adventure stories was having an adventure of his own.
Yeah.
And that's where the caper element came in. And that was loads of fun to write.
Yeah.
And funny, this book is not only a historical novel, but it's also kind of like a family history novel, because the restaurant that's in the book, it's actually in all my books, the New Genesee, was owned by my grandfather who
Cool.
passed away before I was born. But I grew up listening to these stories that my father would tell about growing up in on Genesee Street above the restaurant in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And he told me about a boxer who came in. Who was an alcoholic who would take off his diamond rings and give them to my father to hold until he
Wow.
came back from his bender. It wasn't Jimmy Slattery, but I remember my dad telling me that story. My dad would hold on to him till the guy came back. And he said one time the guy was gone for like a month and he didn't know if the guy died, if he
Yeah.
should pawn the
Yeah.
rings, sell them. And then the guy showed up and took the rings back. My
By the
dad
way,
actually had a
that's a great impetus into peril. The fact that Stryker gets these rings and oh my
right.
God, what are we going to do with these rings? And
Yeah.
hence violence. Yeah.
Yeah, and we put it right up front, so the action starts right away. Another story, family history. Jimmy Slattery was in my grandfather's restaurant. My father was working that night. By this time, his days in the ring were over, and he was drinking pretty heavily. My dad didn't know who he was, and he was going to throw him out. He was bothering the waitresses. And they said, "You can't, and you can't. That's the champ. That's Jimmy Slattery." um, Another time, my dad threw another person out of the restaurant, and the guy slid across the ice and almost got hit by a taxi. And my dad was afraid he was gonna go to jail. He was gonna kill the guy. That's in the book, and it's Slattery who skids across
Right.
the ice.
Yeah.
So I was taking history and I was taking family history and family lore and just combining them as best I could.
Ton of fun.
A lot of fun.
Yeah, it's the first, readers are always trying to grapple with what is this thing I'm reading? What is this world? What is this genre? And if you're a writer, you ask all kinds of fussy genre questions the first 10 or 20 pages in. And
Right.
I just kept wondering, like, wait, what is this thing? Which for me, I love that. I love to keep
Yeah.
asking, like, oh, well, that's now there's a horse and now there's like, okay, let's keep riding this thing. And so, yeah, it's really a pleasure to experience. So this is your third novel, and I hope that it will not let you rest for a while. But after you do get to rest and get back to work, what's next?
There is no rest. It took me 30 years to get published, so there's no stopping now.
Good,
So
good.
the next novel is going to come out in 2025. It's called Pearl, After Pearl. And it is, I call it my pandemic novel, even though
Okay,
it has nothing to do with the pandemic. I call it that because I started it right when we were locked down and finished it 2 years almost to the day, which was very fast for me. But it was no real research was needed for this one. And, a lot of people during the pandemic and the lockdown, a lot of my creative friends, writers, visual artists, they couldn't produce anything during that time period.
sure.
It was just too scary and too awful, and
Yeah.
they were stifled creatively. Um, I was just the opposite. You read to escape. I wrote to escape. I just put the blinders on and said, let me get out of this world where I have no control, and let me write, um, create a world where I am in control. And so, again, it's set in Buffalo. It's set in, just after Pearl Harbor, where the title comes from. And uh, during the lockdown, I was in a big house with a little one-eyed dog who's asleep in the other room, and I wrote about a detective who's on a just woke up on the floor. He's a house detective at the Hotel Lafayette. Wakes up on the floor of his hotel room after a 5 day bender, kind of like the one that Slattery went on in Yesteryear. Seems to be a theme.
Yeah, yeah. Five
He
day
wakes up.
benders. That's
Yeah,
a
he
good
wakes up
motif.
after. Yeah, he wakes up after 5 days, can't remember a thing. Takes inventory, and there's 2 shots fired from his gun, and he can't remember firing his gun. And the police want to talk to him about a missing person who was last seen with him. So
Wow.
he has to put together the last 5 days of his life and solve that crime. I wrote it and I blogged about it. While I was writing, I said, "Well, I'll never know if this is. I don't know if this is ever going to get published. I'm just writing this for me, just to get through these, these dark days when I can't leave the house, and this is something fun for me to do." And I showed it to my publisher at SFWP, and he said, "This is. I love this. Make it a series." And I go, "Oh, okay." So
Great.
we'll see if that's in the works too. That's
You're
coming
on
up.
the Fran Striker path, and I hope that you don't experience anyone cursing you or spitting on your lip or anything like this.
I hope not either.
Stephen Eoannou, it's great to meet you. Now that I've read Yesteryear, I'm going to circle back and start with muscle cars, right? And then I'll wait in 2025 when After Pearl comes along. Maybe you'll come back if we're all still here in the same kind of world we live in. Who
Yeah.
knows? Maybe you'll come back and talk to us about that.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Thank you for having me today.